The prison block went quiet when the new inmate stepped inside. He was black, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with a calm that didn't belong in a place like this. No eye contact, no swagger, no fear. That calm irritated the wrong man. The bully leaned back on the bench, sneering as the newcomer passed. "Look at this one," he laughed. "Walking in here like he owns the place." The gang chuckled. Someone bumped the man's shoulder on purpose. Another knocked his tray to the floor. Food spilled. Shoes stepped through it. "Pick it up," the bully said softly, leaning close. "Or I'll teach you how things work in here." The new inmate didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even look angry. He just slowly raised his eyes, and for half a second, the bully felt something he couldn't explain. A cold, familiar pressure in his chest. The kind soldiers feel right before everything goes wrong. Because what that bully didn't know, what no one in that block knew yet, was that the man standing in front of him wasn't just another prisoner. He was a special forces legend, and this prison was about to learn the difference between strength and experience. Stay with me until the end, because what happens next inside that prison will flip the power structure upside down. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. Riverside Correctional Facility sat like a concrete tumor in the middle of Nevada desert, surrounded by 3 layers of razor wire and the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. Built in 1972, it housed 2,000 men who society had decided weren't worth saving. The kind of place where reputations were carved with broken glass and respect was measured in scars. Inside those walls, every day was a war. Every conversation was a negotiation. Every breath was permission to take the next one. Guards walked their routes like tourists in a foreign country, knowing they were visitors in someone else's kingdom. The real power belonged to the inmates. And at the top of that food chain sat Marcus "Tank" Williams. Tank wasn't just big, he was geological. 6'8", 300 pounds of muscle wrapped around a spine made of pure violence. His arms were thick as telephone poles, decorated with tattoos that told the story of every man he'd broken, every territory he'd claimed, every debt he'd collected in blood. Prison had been his home for 8 years, and in that time, he'd built an empire based on one simple rule: respect him or regret existing. The man had followers. Not friends, followers. Men who understood that standing next to Tank meant protection, and standing against him meant a trip to the medical wing, or worse. His inner circle included Rodriguez, a wiry Cuban who moved like a knife through water, and Big Jim, whose hands were so large they looked like industrial equipment. Together, they controlled everything: drug flow, gambling, protection rackets, even which inmates got to use the phones. Tank's domain was Cell Block C, the most dangerous section of Riverside. Guards avoided it unless absolutely necessary. New inmates were processed there like cattle, sorted into categories of useful, harmless, or target practice. The system had worked perfectly for years, until Tuesday morning, when Marcus Washington stepped through those steel doors. Washington looked ordinary: average height, lean build, skin the color of dark coffee. Early 40s, maybe. Clean-shaven head, no visible tattoos, hands that looked like they'd never thrown a punch. He carried his bedding like he was checking into a hotel, not entering hell on earth. That alone should have been a warning sign. Men don't walk into Riverside looking relaxed, unless they're either completely insane or completely dangerous. But Tank saw none of that. He saw fresh meat, another body to add to his collection, another soul to crush under his boot. The big man was holding court near the phones, telling a story about the time he'd hospitalized 3 guards during a riot. His audience laughed at all the right moments, nodded when they should, and kept their eyes respectfully lowered. "So there I was," Tank continued, flexing his massive shoulders. 3 of them pigs coming at me with batons, and I grabbed the first one by the throat, lifted him clean off the ground. He demonstrated with his hands, showing how he'd squeezed. started turning blue like a baby's blanket. The laughter stopped when Washington walked past. Not because he did anything dramatic. He just existed in Tank's peripheral vision, and that was enough to shift the energy in the room. The newcomer found an empty table, sat down, and began organizing his few possessions with methodical precision. Every movement deliberate, every gesture economical. Rodriguez elbowed Tank. "Check out the new fish, boss. Looks like he thinks he's at summer camp." Tank studied Washington with the predatory focus of a shark circling wounded prey. Something about the man's posture bothered him. The way he sat, back straight but relaxed, hands visible but ready. It reminded Tank of something he couldn't quite place, a memory that made his jaw clench. "Let's go welcome him to the neighborhood," Tank announced, standing up to his full, intimidating height. The trio approached Washington's table like storm clouds rolling across clear sky. Other inmates sensed the shift and began clearing out, recognizing the signs of incoming violence. Some pressed against the walls to watch. Others found urgent business elsewhere. Everyone knew the drill. Washington didn't look up from arranging his things. He placed his toothbrush parallel to his soap, aligned his towel with military precision, and folded his extra shirt into a perfect square. The attention to detail was almost hypnotic. "Hey there, new guy," Tank said, his voice carrying the artificial friendliness of a snake oil salesman. "Name's Tank. I run things around here. Thought I'd come over and help you get oriented." Washington continued his organizing. He picked up a small notebook, opened it to a blank page, and began writing something in handwriting so neat it looked like a computer font. Tank's smile faltered. In 8 years of prison politics, no one had ever ignored him. Not once. Men jumped to attention when he spoke. They stammered responses. They showed fear or respect or desperate attempts at both. But this newcomer was treating him like furniture. Rodriguez stepped closer, trying to peer over Washington's shoulder at the notebook. "Boss is talking to you, fish. Where I come from, that means you answer." Washington finished writing his sentence. He capped his pen with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than Rodriguez's voice. Only then did he lift his eyes to meet Tank's gaze. What Tank saw in those eyes made his breath catch. Not fear, not defiance, not the desperate bravado of a man trying to prove he belonged. Something else entirely. Something cold and measuring and infinitely patient. The look of someone who had seen things that would break other men's minds, who had walked through valleys Tank couldn't imagine. "Is there something you need?" Washington asked. His voice was quiet, controlled, carrying just a trace of Southern accent. Tank felt his anger spike at the casual dismissal. "Yeah, there's something I need. I need you to understand how things work around here. See, I'm the king of this castle, and you just walked into my throne room without showing proper respect." Washington nodded slowly, as if considering this information. "I understand. Good. Then you'll understand why you owe me tax on whatever commissary money you got. Consider it rent for breathing my air." "I don't think I'll be doing that," Washington replied, returning his attention to his notebook. The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Every inmate within earshot froze. Even the guards at the far end of the block sensed something had shifted, their hands unconsciously moving toward their radios. Tank's face went through several color changes, settling on a shade of red that suggested internal combustion. No one said no to Tank Williams. Not in 8 years, not ever. "Excuse me?" Tank's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a shout. Washington looked up again. This time, his gaze swept over Tank's massive frame with the clinical detachment of someone examining a broken appliance. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute certainty. "You heard me correctly the first time. The temperature in cell block C dropped 10 degrees. Not literally, but every man in that room felt the chill crawl up his spine as Tank Williams processed what had just happened. His empire, built on fear and broken bones, had just been challenged by a man who looked like he belonged in an accounting office, not a maximum security prison. Rodriguez shifted nervously. his knife fighter instincts telling him something was terribly wrong. Big Jim cracked his knuckles, a sound like branches breaking in a winter storm. The usual background noise of the block, conversations, card games, the shuffle of feet, had vanished completely. Even the guards had stopped their routine patrol, sensing the electric tension building in the air. Tank's massive hands clenched into fists that could cave in a man's ribcage. 8 years of absolute dominance had taught him that challenges needed to be crushed immediately, publicly, and with enough violence to discourage future rebellion. His reputation wasn't just about power, it was about survival. In a place like Riverside, weakness spread like infection, and infected kings got buried. "You know what?" Tank said, his voice carrying across the block like distant thunder. "I think you misunderstood the situation here. Let me explain it better." He grabbed the edge of Washington's table with both hands and flipped it. The metal surface crashed against the concrete wall with a sound like a car accident. Washington's carefully organized possessions scattered across the floor, his notebook sliding under another inmate's bunk, his folded shirt unraveling like a flag of surrender. Except Washington didn't look surrendered. He sat perfectly still in his chair, hands resting calmly on his knees, watching Tank's display with the detached interest of a scientist observing lab rats. When the echoes of the crash faded, he spoke again. "That was unnecessary." Tank laughed, but it sounded forced now, hollow. "Unnecessary? Boy, you ain't seen unnecessary yet. Stand up." Washington considered this request for a moment, then slowly rose from his chair. Standing, he looked even less imposing next to Tank's towering bulk. The size difference was comical, a heavyweight boxer facing off against a marathon runner. Every inmate in the block could see how this would end. Tank would break him in half, literally if necessary. And Washington would join the long list of men who'd learned the hard way that Riverside belonged to Marcus Williams. "Now," Tank continued, stepping close enough that Washington could smell the stale cigarettes on his breath, "you're gonna pick up every single piece of your junk. Then you're gonna walk over to my cell and give me everything valuable you got. Money, cigarettes, whatever your family sent you. Consider it tuition for the education you just received." Washington looked down at his scattered belongings, then back up at Tank. When he smiled, it wasn't the desperate grin of a man trying to defuse a bomb. It was something else entirely. Something that made Rodriguez take an unconscious step backward. "No," Washington said simply. The word hit Tank like a physical blow. His face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and raw fury in the space of a heartbeat. Nobody said no to Tank Williams. Not twice. Not ever. "Rodriguez!" Tank barked, without taking his eyes off Washington. "Hold this fool's arms!" Rodriguez hesitated. Something about Washington's calm was infectious, spreading doubt through Tank's crew like poison through a water supply. The newcomer stood there like he was waiting for a bus, not facing down 3 of the most dangerous men in Nevada's correctional system. "I said hold him!" Tank roared. Rodriguez moved forward reluctantly, reaching for Washington's left arm. What happened next defied every law of physics that Tank understood. Rodriguez was fast, prison yard fast, with reflexes honed by a dozen knife fights, but his hand never made contact. Washington shifted his weight slightly, a movement so subtle it was barely visible. Rodriguez's grab met empty air as the target simply wasn't there anymore. The Cuban stumbled forward, off balance, and Washington's hand touched his shoulder in what looked like a gentle pat. Rodriguez collapsed like his bones had turned to water. The entire block erupted. Inmates pressed against their cell doors, shouting and pointing. Some laughed. Others cursed. A few just stared in stunned silence at Rodriguez writhing on the floor, clutching his shoulder and making sounds no human throat should produce. Big Jim charged without waiting for orders. 350 pounds of pure rage launched itself at Washington like a freight train jumping its tracks. The impact should have scattered Washington across the concrete like roadkill. Instead, Jim found himself flying through the air, his momentum redirected by forces he couldn't comprehend. He crashed into a row of chairs with enough force to bend steel, then lay perfectly still. Tank's world tilted sideways. In 30 seconds, his two lieutenants had been neutralized by a man who moved like he was underwater, every gesture flowing into the next with liquid precision. Washington hadn't thrown a punch, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't even broken a sweat. "What the hell are you?" Tank whispered. Washington straightened his shirt, which had somehow remained perfectly neat despite the chaos around him. "I'm someone who asked you nicely to leave me alone." Tank's hands trembled as rage and something else, something cold and unfamiliar, battled for control of his nervous system. He'd built his reputation on violence. But this wasn't violence. This was something surgical, precise, professional. The kind of thing you saw in movies about government assassins and special operations soldiers. The realization hit him like ice water in his veins. Government assassins. Special operations. "You're military," Tank said, the words falling out of his mouth before he could stop them. Washington neither confirmed nor denied it. He began collecting his scattered belongings with the same methodical care he'd shown before. Each item was picked up, examined, and placed in its proper position. The notebook went in his left pocket. The folded shirt was refolded and tucked under his arm. The toothbrush and soap were aligned with mathematical precision. Around them, cell block C buzzed with nervous energy. Inmates who'd witnessed the impossible were already spreading the story, each telling adding new details and embellishments. Within an hour, every man in Riverside would know that Tank Williams, the unbreakable king of the prison, had been humbled by a quiet newcomer who fought like a ghost. Tank watched Washington organize his possessions and felt something crack inside his chest. Not his ribs, though those ached from tension. Something deeper. The foundation of his identity. The bedrock certainty that he was the most dangerous thing in any room he entered. "This ain't over," Tank said. But the words sounded hollow even to him. Washington finished his organizing and looked up one final time. His eyes held no anger, no triumph, no satisfaction. Just a kind of weary patience that suggested he'd had this conversation before, in other places, with other men who thought they were kings. "Yes," Washington said quietly. "It is." He walked away, leaving Tank standing alone among the wreckage of his reputation, while Rodriguez moaned on the floor and Big Jim counted his broken ribs. The king of Riverside Correctional had just learned that there were forces in the world beyond his understanding, and one of them was living in cell block C. But this was only the beginning, because Marcus Washington hadn't come to Riverside to hide from his past or serve his time quietly. He'd come for a reason that would shake the entire prison system to its foundation. And Tank Williams was about to discover that challenging a Special Forces legend was the least of his problems. Of his problems. The news of what happened in Cell Block C spread through Riverside like wildfire in dry grass. By dinner time, every inmate, every guard, every administrator knew the same impossible story. Tank Williams, the undisputed king of the prison, had been dismantled by a quiet newcomer who moved like smoke and struck like lightning. But stories have a way of growing in the telling. What started as Rodriguez and Big Jim getting dropped by precise pressure point strikes became tales of Washington throwing grown men through concrete walls. What began as Tank backing down became legends of the big man begging for mercy. By lights out, Marcus Washington had transformed from a mysterious newcomer into something approaching mythology. In the administrative offices above the cell blocks, Warden Patricia Holbrook stared at the incident reports with the kind of headache that aspirin couldn't touch. 23 years of running correctional facilities had taught her to read between the lines of guard reports, and what she was reading made no sense. "No injuries requiring medical attention," she read aloud to her deputy warden, James Crawford. "No weapons involved. No property damage except for one overturned table." But somehow Tank Williams's entire power structure collapsed in under 5 minutes. Crawford, a former Marine who thought he'd seen everything, shook his head slowly. "Ma'am, I've talked to 3 guards who witnessed it. They all tell the same story. This Washington character moved like he had supernatural powers, disabled 2 grown men without breaking a sweat. Holbrook pulled up Washington's file on her computer, scrolling through page after page of redacted information. His criminal history was surprisingly thin for someone sentenced to Riverside. Armed robbery, they said, but the details were classified above her clearance level. His military record was completely blacked out, except for discharge date and status. Honorable discharge, which was unusual for someone who ended up in maximum security. James, call the Bureau of Prisons. I want to know why they sent us someone whose file looks like a CIA document. Meanwhile, in the depths of cell block C, Washington sat on his narrow bunk, reading a paperback novel like nothing had happened. The book was Tom Clancy, something about submarines and nuclear warfare. His reading glasses perched on the end of his nose made him look more like a college professor than the man who'd just revolutionized prison politics. 3 cells down, Tank paced back and forth like a caged tiger. His reputation lay in ruins. His crew was in the medical wing, and every inmate in the block was looking at him like he'd lost his mind. 8 years of absolute dominance had ended in 30 seconds, and he still couldn't understand how. "I don't get it, man," whispered Clarence Jenkins, Tank's remaining lieutenant. "How does a dude that size drop Rodriguez? Rodriguez been cutting people since he was 12. Tank stopped pacing and gripped the cell bars until his knuckles went white. "He ain't normal, Clarence. The way he moved, the way he looked at me, that wasn't street fighting. That was something else entirely." "What you thinking, boss?" Tank's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I'm thinking we stepped on something we don't understand. And I'm thinking it's gonna bite us back." Down the corridor, other inmates were having similar conversations. The power vacuum left by Tank's fall was already creating ripples. Smaller gangs were eyeing each other, wondering if this was their chance to make a move. The Aryan Brotherhood was holding emergency meetings. The Mexican Mafia was positioning soldiers. Everyone sensed opportunity in the chaos. Everyone except Washington, who turned a page in his book and adjusted his reading glasses. The next morning brought new developments. Washington's breakfast routine became a spectacle. Inmates lined the corridors to watch him walk to the cafeteria, hoping to witness more impossibility. But the man they saw was disappointingly ordinary. He selected his food with the same methodical precision he applied to everything, found an empty table, and ate in complete silence. That silence bothered people more than violence would have. In prison, silence usually meant plotting. It meant preparation. It meant someone was about to make a move that would reshape the landscape. But Washington's silence felt different. It felt like patience. Officer Martinez, a 10-year veteran of Riverside's guard force, found herself studying Washington during his morning routine. Something about his posture nagged at her, reminding her of her brother who'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan. The way Washington scanned the room without seeming to look at anything. The way he positioned himself with clear sight lines to all exits. The way he ate with his non-dominant hand, keeping his right hand free. "That's military," she muttered to her partner, Officer Chen. "That's definitely military." Chen nodded. "Question is, what kind? And what's he doing in here?" Their questions would have to wait. At 10:30 that morning, Washington received his first official visitor. The name on the visitor log made Warden Holbrook's blood pressure spike. Colonel Sarah Vance, Defense Intelligence Agency. The kind of visitor who didn't make social calls to maximum security prisons. The meeting took place in the secure conference room, monitored by cameras but not audio recording per Colonel Vance's explicit instructions. She was a lean woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and eyes like winter mornings. When she sat across from Washington, her first words weren't a greeting. "Status report, Sergeant Major." Washington closed his Tom Clancy novel and looked up. For the first time since entering Riverside, his carefully maintained civilian facade cracked slightly. His spine straightened, his shoulders squared. The accountant disappeared, replaced by something harder. Mission parameters unchanged, ma'am. Target has made no contact attempts. Intelligence gathering proceeding as planned. And the incident yesterday? Washington's expression didn't change. Unavoidable exposure. Local power structure required adjustment to maintain operational security. Colonel Vance leaned back in her chair. Marcus, you've been undercover for 8 months. The target still hasn't made contact, and now you've blown your cover in the most spectacular way possible. Maybe it's time to consider extraction. Negative, ma'am. The target will surface. Intelligence indicates he's planning something significant. My presence here is the only way to prevent it. At what cost? Every intelligence agency in the country is going to want to know why a Delta Force operator is sitting in a Nevada prison. Our cover story won't hold up under serious scrutiny. Washington picked up his book again. Then we better hope the target makes his move soon. Colonel Vance stood to leave, but paused at the door. Marcus, be careful. I know you can handle yourself, but you're operating without backup in a hostile environment. If things go sideways, extraction might not be possible. After she left, Washington returned to his cell to find it surrounded by curious inmates. Word had spread that he'd received a military visitor, confirming suspicions that had been building since yesterday's demonstration. But confirmation brought new questions. What was a military operator doing in civilian prison? Who was he hunting? And what would happen when he found his target? Tank Williams had been asking himself the same questions. Sitting in his cell, nursing wounded pride and planning his next move, he'd come to a disturbing conclusion. Washington wasn't here by accident. Someone had sent him. Someone with resources and authority that made Tank's prison connections look like amateur hour. The question was whether Tank was the target or just collateral damage in someone else's war. That afternoon, during yard time, the prison's delicate ecosystem continued its reorganization around Washington's presence. He claimed a bench in the far corner, opened his book, and read peacefully while chaos swirled around him. 3 separate fights broke out as various factions tested boundaries in Tank's absence. The guards responded with typical efficiency, breaking up conflicts and sending troublemakers to solitary confinement. Washington never looked up from his book, but he was watching, always watching, because somewhere in this concrete maze was the man he'd come to find. A former military contractor named Vincent Kozlov, who'd stolen classified weapons designs and disappeared into the federal prison system. Intelligence suggested Kozlov was planning to sell those designs to foreign agents, using the prison's smuggling networks to facilitate the transaction. Washington's mission was simple in concept, impossibly complex in execution. Find Kozlov, determine his contacts, and prevent the sale by any means necessary. The problem was that Kozlov had been moving through the federal system under assumed identities, and Washington's only lead was that the man would eventually surface at Riverside. The incident with Tank had accelerated Washington's timeline considerably. His cover as a small-time armed robber was now completely blown. Every inmate, guard, and administrator knew he was something more dangerous than his file suggested. That attention would make it harder to operate, but it might also flush out his target. Because if Kozlov was at Riverside, he'd want to know why a military operator had suddenly appeared in his sanctuary. As the sun set behind the razor wire, casting long shadows across the exercise yard, Washington closed his book and prepared for whatever came next. The hunt was entering a new phase, and the stakes were higher than anyone in that prison could imagine. The weapon designs Kozlov had stolen weren't just classified, they were revolutionary. The kind of technology that could shift the balance of global power overnight. And somewhere in the concrete labyrinth of Riverside Correctional, a traitor was preparing to sell America's military secrets to the highest bidder. Washington had come here to stop him. The confrontation with Tank had been an unfortunate distraction, but now, with his cover blown and his presence known throughout the prison, the real mission could finally begin. The legend was no longer hiding, and Riverside Correctional was about to discover what happened. when you put a special forces operator in a cage with his prey. The silence that followed Washington's visitor stretched through Riverside like a held breath. Every corridor hummed with whispered theories. Every cell block buzzed with nervous energy. The military woman's presence had confirmed what everyone suspected, but nobody wanted to believe. They weren't just housing a dangerous inmate. They were hosting something far more lethal. Vincent Kozlov felt that tension in his bones. Sitting in his cell in Block D, 3 sections away from the chaos Washington had created, he stared at the crude mirror mounted above his sink and saw a dead man looking back. The face reflected there belonged to Thomas Brennan, small-time drug dealer from Detroit, but the eyes belonged to someone else entirely. Someone who'd spent 15 years moving weapons and secrets through channels that didn't officially exist. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. Kozlov had been planning his final transaction, the sale that would set him up for life in some country without extradition treaties. The buyers were already in position. The payment was secured. All he needed was the merchandise, hidden in a location only he knew about. And then Marcus Washington appeared like a ghost from his past. Kozlov pulled a small photograph from between the pages of his Bible. The image showed him in military fatigue standing next to a younger Washington during a classified operation in Syria. Both men wore the expression of soldiers who'd seen too much and survived too little. That was 7 years ago, before Kozlov decided his country wasn't paying him enough for the secrets he carried. He'd been careful, changed his name, his appearance, his entire identity. The federal marshals thought they were transferring Thomas Brennan, a nobody dealer looking at 10 years for distribution. They had no idea they were moving one of America's most wanted traitors through their system. But Washington knew. Somehow, some way, the man had tracked him here. Kozlov tore the photograph into small pieces and flushed them down his toilet. Then he pulled out a small piece of paper hidden in his shoe and began writing in a code only 3 people in the world could read. The message was simple: package ready for delivery. Buyer must collect immediately. Complications have arisen. Down in Block C, Washington was having his own complications. His cell had become a tourist attraction. Inmates found excuses to walk past, hoping to catch a glimpse of the man who'd dismantled Tank Williams with surgical precision. The attention made operational security impossible, but it also provided unexpected opportunities. Information flowed through prisons like water through cracked concrete, and Washington had become the center of every conversation. Inmates who'd never spoken to each other were suddenly sharing theories about his identity. Guards who'd worked different shifts were comparing notes. Even the administrative staff was buzzing with speculation. That buzz reached the ears of Dmitry Volkov, a Russian national serving time for arms trafficking. Volkov had connections that stretched from Brighton Beach to Moscow, and those connections were very interested in certain classified military designs. When word reached him that a special forces operator was hunting someone in Riverside, he knew his business partner was in trouble. Volkov made his own coded phone call that evening during the approved calling hours. The conversation sounded like a discussion about his sick grandmother in St. Petersburg, but the words carried a different message entirely. The merchandise they'd been expecting might not be available. Security had been compromised. Alternative arrangements needed immediate activation. That night, as Riverside settled into its uneasy silence, the chess pieces were finally in motion. Washington sat reading his book, knowing his target was close. Kozlov prepared for a final desperate gamble, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the razor wire, foreign agents moved toward a rendezvous that would never happen. Because when you put a special forces legend in a cage with his prey, there's only one possible outcome. The hunt was ending exactly as Washington had planned.